This is Kimberly Quinn, host of the Mindcraft podcast, and I can't tell you how much fun I have had doing this podcast. I started when the world closed over the pandemic in an attempt to spread some positivity out there and give people some strategies to enhance their own well being and reduce anxiety and all of that. Now, 2 years later, we're still going strong and now listened to by 52 countries across the world. And I've even helped some of my students get going with their own podcasts. It's super easy to do. And I'll tell you, if you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it is the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. I'll just explain for you. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. It is a ball. Start today. Greetings, Minecrafters, and welcome to another Minecraft episode this morning. And here in northern Vermont right now, it's just this gorgeous. It's 7:27 in the morning right now where I am, and it's just beautiful. There's a bird symphony, and I just had to throw all that in there. All right, my name is Kimberly Quinn, and I am elated to have this conversation with you today. And it's about being wired for spirituality. So, before you turn me off, which is totally okay, this is not about religion in any way, and there's going to be some content here. In other words, I'm not just going to babble away with opinion, which I try not to do anyway. But I'm talking about being wired for spirituality as a brain thing, and since my thing is cognitive psychology, I could talk about the brain all day long. I don't have one bored minute. And here's the other thing is that, we think touchy-feely. When we talk about spirituality, people are afraid to dive in. It's just touchy-feely. And okay, well, here's the thing. No, it isn't. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm reading a book called The Awakened Brain by Lisa Miller. And it's a fantastic book. It's all research-based, very research-based, also very easy to read. It's not like that. It's not like sticking pins in your head. She takes some facts and anyway, I'm going to deliver the message to you today. Okay, so being wired for spirituality, it's a brain thing. And I think, most of us are aware that the current generation of young adults is among the most anxious and depressed the United States has ever seen. And part of Lisa's message is that, underneath, and we're not saying everybody, those polarizations don't usually work. Basically depression and spirituality kind of like, opposite sides of the same coin. And that really what's going on, and not just young adults, but many people who are depressed, though she talks about specifically developmentally, those questioning times teenagers and young adults have, that much of that, the symptoms of depression are really what's going on much of the time is a craving for spirituality. So what we're talking about that is actual evidence of how depression causes changes in the brain, which we already knew, and then how we can actually see, the fact that we're wired for spirituality and actually can see differences in people who have a strong, whom have a strong spiritual importance in their lives. I guess that's what we're saying. So we're talking about cortical thinning. So the cerebral cortex, it's a layer that kind of wraps around the brain. Okay, so the frontal cortex is responsible for all of our higher reasoning stuff, like decision making, judgment, the ability to plan. What we're going to be later in the future. Also planning. It's taco night, and it's I said reasoning, judgment, decision making, just all that kind of higher metacognitive stuff that we need in our day-to-day lives. And think of the cortex as kind of like the bark of a tree, and so that layer is just responsible for so much. And we find that in those who are depressed, that that layer, this important layer that has so much to do with our higher reasoning process, is also is thinner. It's thinner than those that for those that are at higher risk for depression. And of course, there's a little nature nurture thing going on here because when we're talking about human beings and non-human animals, actually, it's very difficult to separate genetics. And we know that the gamut of mental illnesses are genetic, partially genetic. Certainly depression and anxiety, definitely addiction. Just go on and on and on. ADHD, autism. Those aren't the ADHD and autism are not considered mental illnesses. They're considered neurodevelopmental issues. But you get the drift. Things are genetic. And so when Lisa's talking about her book, she's, it's research wise that we can see generationally in both kids and grown-ups, this change in cortical thinning before the symptoms of depression have even manifested. So there's genetic evidence right there, and we're talking about the actual structure of the brain. This is heavy duty stuff. And of course, there's also the part, because it's not necessarily all genetic, right? This is the nature nurture piece, because we know when there are people in the house, a person or people in the home who are struggling with depression. You can fill in the blank with other things, that the environment of the home changes. So, and as we've discussed many times, things are on a spectrum. Life is on a spectrum. So we have mild depression to middle depression to severe depression, and every kind of gradient in between. And it's just, we know for a fact, it changes the atmosphere. It basically kind of changes, metaphorically speaking, changes the air we breathe in the home for everybody who's there. And just everything, all the interactions, the general tone in the house, it all changes when there's somebody part of the family or more than one person who are struggling with depression. Okay, so here's another tidbit. In addition to the frontal cortex being necessary for reasoning and decision making and judgment and just all the higher thinking type stuff we're talking about, the cortex also helps us make sense of our world. It's kind of helps us connect the inner world with the outer world. So think of how huge that is. We've got our whole inner life going on, and then we've got the reality kind of wrapping around us on a day-to-day basis. And a thinner cortex actually reduces our capacity to perceive and orient to the world around us. And also the ability to see ourselves clearly, and how, what our place is, how we fit into this reality that surrounds us. So this is huge. So we're saying that the cortical connection is gigantic, because it kind of is the byway, or a large part of the byway. I'm thinking of like that's like a 6-lane traffic kind of road right now, but really, so it connects our inner and outer world. So if this is been dramatically thinned due to depression and the distorted thinking that comes from depression and all these other things, that this is a big problema. This is huge. So Lisa talks about this research in her book, The Awakened Brain, right, which I would highly recommend to any of you. It's really a down to earth way to explain all this stuff about how depression, because of the cortical thinning, actually causes a narrowing of our perceptual field. Also, huge. Our perception is our reality. I'm sure many of you, most of you, have heard that how we perceive things. Right? We have the sensory stuff coming in, but how we put it together creates our reality, literally. And so depression is therefore distorting our sense of relationship to each other, and ourselves with our outer world, and therefore uh, to each other. So basically, depression is, in a very neurological sense, structurally speaking, with the brain, is preventing us from seeing the bigger picture. And of course, I could just, nerd out with this brain stuff all day long. So I got pretty excited when I was reading about Lisa's team deciding to take a look at the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and then the precuneus areas of the brain, which have already been associated with depression. Like, we already know that. So just to give you a little back brain, background here. The occipital lobe is in the back, kind of like where the nape of your neck is, and then expands out a little bit. And that's for our vision. That's a visual field. So when the sensory information comes in, thalamus redirects, directs things, and the occipital lobe would be kind of where the vision lies. And then the parietal lobe is a little bit up from that, kind of like the bald spot area or a bald spot area for men. I'm thinking like a monk. I'm thinking like Friar Tuck kind of monk, not current today monks. Where they would have like in the like Renaissance times. You see, they had the big old circle, the back of their head. That's the parietal area, and this is for our spatial orientation. So, how I explain it in cognitive psych, when not in a relation to spirituality, but it is when we're trying to parallel park, because most of them, they're obviously very young, traditional age college students. They can relate to have taken their driver's test not that long ago, and what it's like to kind of back up, move forward, try not to clip the person in front of you, behind you. Well, that's the parietal lobe kind of making all that happen, and then the precuneus part of the parietal lobe. That's the third part we're talking about. Is what the part of us the part of the parietal lobe helps us reflect. It helps us reflect. So this means that the focus, because these three areas of the brain, the occipital, the parietal lobe, and the precuneus area of the parietal lobe, means that the focus was on the research, which what the research was focused on perception, orientation, and reflection. Perception, orientation, and reflection. So remember, we're saying that this is now how depression affects these areas of the brain is on brain scans. We can actually see it. So it's not just touchy feely, you know, depression might cause. And typically in psychology, we'll say correlation, because that's kind of like a little safer, I would say. But basically, correlation is just about a relationship. We're talking about causation here, about causation making, actually depression actually creating changes in the brain, specifically in these areas that involve our higher thinking, and also our spatial orientation, our perception, and our ability to reflect on our lives. This is huge. Okay, so this is where I could just nerd out forever. So MRIs, I'm sure most of you know what MRIs. MRIs are, of course, magnetic resonance imagery, and that's that coffin-like thing where you claustrophobic, and you go, you usually you have one of those, you blow out a knee or something like that, and they can see, bones, ligaments, all that kind of thing, and areas of need that in need of repair. An fMRI, with the little italics, the F is in italics, and that means functional. So an fMRI means that we can actually see activity in the brain, and it lights up with the fire colors like red and orange and yellow when there's activity. So basically, the fMRI is a scan that follows the brain activity, which we can tell, because the most active parts of the brain are obviously consuming the most oxygen, and so then there's heat, blah blah. So that's how the fMRI works. And Lisa talks about taking a look at brain images of people who were at both at high and low risk for depression. She looked at the brain scans of people who were at high and low risk for depression, and then sort of compared and also contrasted the brain structures of those at high risk for depression, who also reported, strong personal spirituality, and those who did not have this. So folks with the high and low risk of depression, and also whether um, their own inner life, their own personal inner spiritual life, was important or not. Okay, and so now for the totally cool part is the results. And Lisa's team found that her participants reported spirituality as being highly important, showed a healthier neural structure than those participants who reported that spirituality, to have their own inner life, right? As Oprah calls it, our own inner life. Personal spirituality was of medium, low, or of no importance. Wow. Wow. So this highly spiritual brain was showing in the brain scans these fire colors, reds, and just all lit up. So she ended up nicknaming, I don't know if she ended up nicknaming it, but they started to call it the red brain, because this highly spiritual brain was like kind of basically on fire with excitement, about life. This red brain, as we're saying, showed like broad and pervasive areas of cortical thickness. Remember, cortical thickness is good, cortical thinness not good. Depression, the depressed brain was showing a very thin cortex, whereas the spiritually rich brain was showing a thick cortex. This is very good news. Remember, thicker cortex is is better for all the things we mentioned, the big stuff, the reasoning, decision making, judgment, planning, and also um, having this ability to reflect and connect our own inner life with our outer world. It's just absolutely huge. And remember, we're not talking about religion here. We're talking about a faith-based life, a spiritually rich life. We're not talking about any of the organized religions out there, though. If that works for you, and that if incorporating your own spiritual personal inner life into an organized religion, fine. We're talking specifically about that inner life and realizing that there's a power bigger than we are, a higher power, source with a capital S, whatever, that spiritual life, and our connection to that higher power, that connection is within each and every one of us, kind of pulling us together, and that this red brain, this spiritually rich brain with a thick cortex, actually it serves as a buffer effect. This is like a spiritual buffer that protects us against depression, especially when we're moving through these kind of developmental windows of depression. People that are higher risk. Wow. So we're saying the spiritual buffer actually works to protect and defend against depression. Okay, so like with the bullets and the bold, here comes the final wrap up with Lisa Miller and her book, The Awakened Brain. Gosh, I love it. And yeah, so they found that for spiritually aware people with a rich inner spiritual life, that it was of importance to them. She said, with or without, like an organized religious or a traditional faith tradition. What I'm trying to say, with or without the religion part, okay? The brain demonstrated the ability to protect itself. The brain demonstrated the ability to protect itself against the long-standing neurological brain changes that are caused by depression. So the red brain, remember, we are wired for this, all of us, regardless of where you live, what kind of family you come from, what kind of money you come from, we all have this, we are all predisposed to spirituality if we sort of embrace it. And this red brain that lit up like nuts with the people who had the rich spiritual lives is actually a buffer that protects us against depression. Awesome. There we go. This is Kimberly Quinn signing off from Northern Vermont. Have a mindful day.